Okay, Jared, you are live. Take it away.
All right, good morning, everybody. Jared Jones here at Sutters Fort State Historic Park. I want to thank you all for tuning in today with me here at Sutters Fort in the middle of Midtown Sacramento, where we are going to learn about John Sutter, why he built the fort at this spot, and the key jobs that played a big role in the development of Sutters Fort and the development of the Sacramento Valley. And it is unfortunate that Sutters Fort is closed right now, that you're not able to visit. And many of you are at home right now doing distance learning, keeping in contact with your teachers. And I wanted to bring Sutters Fort to you here. So I hope you're excited as much as I am to give this program today. For perspective, though, I want to show you what Sutters Fort looks like on the inside. So I'm going to turn this camera around. We're going to come on over here to the big gate, which was the entrance to Sutters Fort in the 1840s, because I want to show you what Sutters Fort looks like on the outside. Right over here, though, while we're walking, we got the central building, which is the original part of the fort. I'm going to talk about that building in a little bit. We're going to be able to see the rooms and the items in those rooms up close during this program. I'm going to step on outside here, and I could tell you that John Sutter never planned on having his fort built in the middle of a big hustling and bustling city. Because here we are in the middle of Midtown Sacramento. We are a mile east, exactly a mile east from the state capitol building at Ellen 10th Street. And a mile beyond that is Old Sacramento State Historic Park, where the California State Railroad Museum is. Right over there, we have Sutter Hospital. You see that we have some folks walking by on the sidewalk enjoying the nice weather, and we got cars going by as well. And the reason why I wanted to show you Sutters Fort on the outside, not only to show that we got these big buildings that tower over the fort today, but we are on a hill. You're going to see these cars going by. They are downhill from us. And that is important as to why Sutter chose to build his fort in this spot on a high hill, because we are 2 miles from the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers, two large rivers that potentially overflow during the winter. So he built on high ground, and we got these big 15 feet high, which were originally made out of adobe brick walls. Now you might see some cannons inside the fort today. And while Sutter did have cannons around the fort was never attacked. So it's important to note that this was not a military fort. This is a trading post fort, very similar to what a fort was in the early 19th century. But we got these big white walls as well that would have been painted with a lime wash to protect the adobe brick from crumbling from the weather. But also Sutter wanted to make sure the fort was able to be seen from a mile to 2 miles away. And what better way to be seen from a mile to 2 miles away than to have big white walls? And it's important to note that the fort in the central building there is the oldest non-native structure in the Sacramento Valley. So picture that there's nothing outside the fort. Vast fields and nothing, except for in the 1840s, there would have been some smaller adobe structures, canvas tents and stuff like that. And we're gonna walk on over here, back underneath the tree into the shade, because it's already getting pretty hot here. And I'm wearing a lot of extra layers today to show you what somebody would have been dressed like in the 1840s here at Sutters Fort. And Sutter never wrote that if it was a hot day or a very hot day. He only wrote in his diary if it was warm or very warm. He never wanted people to know that the Sacramento Valley could get up to high 90s like it is today and into the hundreds as well. But while we're walking over here, who has ever visited Sutters Fort before? Raise your hand if you have ever used the hand function on Zoom. See, we got some folks that have visited Sutters Fort before. That's great. I'm going to turn my camera around here. We're going to talk about Sutters Fort. And I want to introduce myself again. My name is Jared Jones. I am a history interpreter here at Sutters Fort State Historic Park. I am an employee with California State Parks. I sometimes wear a state parks uniform, but this is also my uniform, 1840s pioneer attire. And that's what I wanted to wear for you today, to give you a better idea of life long ago in the 1840s, as we talk about how individuals in the 1840s had a lot of things similar to what we have today, but our modern conveniences, we often take those for granted, because in the 1840s, they had similar things. They were just a lot more complex. But we can't talk about any of this stuff yet until we talk about this man, John Sutter, the proprietor of Sutters Fort. He was born in February 1803 in Kandern, which is a small village on the border of what is today Germany and Switzerland. He grew up in a Swiss household, and he always wanted to go into the military, but with the fall of Napoleon, you didn't need to have large standing armies anymore. And in the late 1820s, he opens a dry goods store in Bergdorf, Switzerland. And by 1834, his business goes under. There's an economic depression in Europe in the 1830s that causes men like Sutter to lose their businesses. And Sutter owed the bank $25,000. He was about to go to debtor's prison before his wife, Anna Sutter, helped him gain a passage aboard a ship going to the United States. And he leaves behind his wife and his family in 1834, but he does reunite with his family eventually 16 years later. But those 16 years that he is away, John Sutter plays a key role in the development of not only the Sacramento Valley, not only of California, but of the American West. He gets to New York in 1834, and he quickly moves on to the westernmost point of the United States, which is Missouri. And he gets involved in the Santa Fe trade, a trade route that was along the old Spanish trail between Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Missouri. And while he's trading along the trail, he starts to hear about this place called California, about how as long as you can get to California, there's an abundance of land. There's the Mexican government. California is owned by Mexico at this time. They are only settled along the coast, near where the former California missions are. And as long as you could get to California, they're giving away free land to people that are loyal to the Mexican government. And he hears from some trappers that had visited the Sacramento Valley in the late 1820s with Jedediah Smith, where they were trapping animals in this area. And they talked about this valley that had a very rich soil, rich to grow any type of agricultural crop. And that's where Sutter realized that this is where he wanted to go. I'm sorry, folks, I have my gimbal kind of gave out on me there in the heat. I'm sorry, folks. Luckily, I got something else here. There we are. So let's talk a little bit. So Sutter starts to hear about this place called California, that they're giving away free land. That he decides that he is going to go there. So he teams up with some fur trappers that are traveling along, that from Missouri, he travels along what is most of the Oregon Trail later, and he gets to this point of Fort Vancouver. He travels overland to Fort Vancouver, which is on the border of Washington and Oregon today. And that's where he decides he's really going to go to California. But he's overshot California because he's there at Fort Vancouver, owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. And so you don't just walk to California by land at that time, so he gets on a ship to Hawaii. That doesn't make any sense. He's traveled from Missouri to Fort Vancouver, now on to Hawaii. But Hawaii was a major trading hub for the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1830s. And ships from all over the world were trading goods in Hawaii. And so that's where Sutter arrives, and he misses the boat to California by 2 weeks. He ends up spending 6 months in Hawaii. He becomes friends with King Kamehameha III, the last king of Hawaii, and he gets 10 Hawaiian workers to help him on his journey to California. And he is able to leave Hawaii by captaining a ship to Fort Sitka, Alaska. He's now captaining a Russian ship going from Hawaii to Sitka, Alaska, drops off goods there, and then he travels down the coast by boat, stopping at Fort Ross, which is the Russian fort just north of Bodega Bay. And then from there, he travels on to Monterey, the capital of Mexican California, where Monterey State Historic Park is today. And he, on July 2nd, 1839, arrives, and he sends a whaling ship along ahead of him to announce that Captain John Sutter of the Swiss Guard has arrived. And he throws a big party on the ship, and he invites the whole town, including the governor, Governor Juan Alvarado. And he asks the governor that he would like to live in California, but not along the coast. He wants to live in the interior. And the governor says, okay, because the Mexican government had tried 5 times to settle this area, and they failed every single time. They thought Sutter was going to fail too. So in August of 1839, Sutter traveled through the Delta to the Sacramento River, hooks over to the American River at a spot 2 miles from where I'm standing at right now. And they notice 20 feet in the air in the trees, debris and driftwood. They notice that these rivers, they overflow all the time. They got to try to find somewhere else. That's not a good spot to settle, because you want to be close to water, but not too close if there's flooding. So they travel up the American River a little bit, and the people on the boat start to get very fearful, because they start to see about 300 California Native Americans assembling along the banks of the river. And at a spot a mile north of where I'm standing is the site of Sutter's Landing. And the natives do not attack, because the only people getting off the boat is John Sutter, those 10 Hawaiians, 2 of them were women, 3 sailors, and a large bulldog. That was Sutter's landing party. And he immediately meets with the chiefs of the local Indian villages, and he tells them his intentions. He would like to live in the interior of California amongst them and establish himself in agriculture. His dream was to always have an agricultural society. And they told him that this area floods all the time. You need to settle on high ground. And they brought him to a point a mile from south of where they were standing at the river, a site where I'm at right now, this high hill in the middle of a floodplain. And this is where Sutter decides that he is going to build his establishment. And he starts to build a permanent structure. That structure is the central building, which is now the original part of the fort. It's where Sutter's office, the doctor's office, and the clerk's office is. And we are going to go up there in a little bit. But this building was incredibly important because Sutter is trying to live in this area. And in 1840, he becomes a Mexican citizen and a representative of the Mexican government. And to properly homestead, you need to build a permanent structure. This was his permanent structure to improve on the land that he wanted to claim for his land grant. And in June of 1841, Sutter gets his Mexican land grant, a land grant that he names New Helvetia, which means New Switzerland after his homeland, a land grant of 48,827 acres. It is everything that we know of Sacramento today, up the Sacramento River to the Sutter Buttes, and all of what is Marysville and Yuba City between the Sacramento and Feather Rivers. It was the largest land grant that you could get under Mexican law, 48,827 acres. And he also in 1841 purchases Fort Ross from the Russian American Fur Company, where Fort Ross State Historic Park is today. He purchases that fort and he moves everything that he can from that fort to here, where he is starting to build up his fort. Now, he doesn't just actually physically move that fort to here. Fort Ross is made out of wood. Sutters Fort was made out of adobe. But he moves all the stuff. He moves a couple thousand head of cattle, several hundred sheep and horses, and a grist mill, and tools for a blacksmith shop, a carpenter shop, a cooper shop, everything that he needs to have a trading post. So now he's got all this stuff, but he's got nobody with skills to do these jobs. And he has to start making some money because he purchases Fort Ross for $30,000 on credit. He needs to start making himself some actual money. And so he gets involved in an industry that had been existing here long before Sutter arrived, and that is trapping animals for their furs. And there's one animal that drove the fur trapping industry ever since the mid 1600s. And over time, when this animal brought trappers to North America, and gradually over time, they moved farther and farther west. In 1820s, they moved into California, trapping this animal living amongst rivers and streams. He's got this big tail that he uses to pack down limbs and mud. And he's got these big teeth that he chews on wood to keep his teeth from growing. And he chews down wood so he can start building up his lodges, and he has to keep chewing on wood because otherwise his teeth are going to grow and grow into the other side of his skull and die. So he has to stay busy as a beaver because this is a beaver. This is the animal that drove the fur trapping industry. Sutter was getting a few dollars for these pelts at this time because this is towards the end of the trapping industry. They were trapping this animal for a particular clothing item. They were setting traps under about 3 feet of water. They were setting about 6 to 8 of these traps a day. They would push down on the springs on the side, put a bait stick to attract the beaver on over, to swim on over, step in the trap and catch them, skin the animals, bring them here to the fort, where Sutter is able to make some quick dollars trading for these. Now, these were then put onto a large willow round where it's nice and taut, so they could be shipped off to a factory where they had the long hairs plucked off, and the soft hair underneath would be shaved off, boiled in mercury. Does mercury sound pretty safe? No. But that mercury helps those hairs bind together to fit to a mold to make hats. You know Abraham Lincoln's top hat? It's made out of beaver felt. This is what drove the fur trapping industry. Fancy top hats, because this hat in the 1840s was worth about $75 to $200. This was a hat worn by the wealthy. This was a sign of status. Common farmers only getting paid about 50 cents a day in Missouri. He can't afford something like this. This is for factory owners and business owners riding down the streets in cities like New York and Boston, riding in their carriages, wearing their top hats. This is class. Now, Sutter, though, had a hat maker that was making wide brim felt hats to protect you from the sun. because there was no sunscreen in the 1840s. It's why you would wear long sleeves, long pants as well to protect you from the sun. Now, a hat maker working with mercury, though, seeps into the pores of their hands, goes into their bloodstream, and goes right to their head and drives them crazy. And that's where the term mad as a hatter comes from. It's from these beaver felt hat makers. Now, there was another animal that Sutter was able to make money on, and that's this guy, the river otter. Sutter was able to get $4 to $5 for a pelt like this, and it was traded with trade ships on the coast. And that's how Sutter was able to bring in other goods that he couldn't easily obtain or make here. And these were traded in Hawaii with Chinese merchants. And by the time this reaches China, this could be worth anywhere from $50 to $200. This would be used as the cuffs and the collars on fancy silk coats, or they would just wear it as a scarf like this. Do I look pretty fancy? By 1840 standards, yes, I do. These were traded for silk, porcelain, and spices. And by the time, silk enters the international market, like my silk scarf, all of a sudden people want to have a silk top hat instead of a beaver felt hat. What do you think this does for all these trappers? There's no reason to trap beavers anymore. And a lot of them become out of jobs. And they come here to Sutter looking for work. Sutter, he's in the middle of trying to build up a fort right now. And so he needs people that have skills. Now, these trappers, they have certain skills that they know how to live off the land. They know how to talk to the local native populations. They know all the trails. And Sutter needs them to get people to come here. So he sends fur trappers back east to encourage people going overland by wagon to come to California. Because by the early 1840s, there's already large wagon parties traveling to Oregon. You might have heard of the Oregon Trail. People were heading there looking for a better way of life. There was an economic depression in the United States in the 1840s. It was carried over from the economic depression in Europe 10 years prior that sent Sutter to come to the United States. And people were traveling by wagon to Oregon looking for a better way of life, but Oregon becomes very populated. And so he sends Sutter sends fur trappers back east to tell the people, don't go to Oregon, come to California, and I will take you there. And quickly, Sutters Fort became the end point on the California Trail. And that is why I'm holding this model of a wagon. And you're probably wondering to yourself right now, Jared, what are you doing? Why are you holding a model of a wagon? I put on my best clothes today, tuned into this program, and to see this program and you're holding a model of a wagon, I want to see a real wagon. And you know what? You're right. Let's go see a real wagon. I'm going to turn my camera around here. We're going to go see our 1840s farm wagon. This is your standard size farm wagon of all wagons coming overland to California in the 1840s. Now, this wagon isn't from the 1840s. It was made in 2002. So this wagon's now 18 years old. It's old enough to vote. It is 10 feet long, 4 feet wide. It's got these wooden arches that you can tie a canvas cover over to protect all of your goods. And we got these large wheels and this long tongue that you can hook up to sets of yoke. That's what this is. This is a yoke, and this is how you could hook up oxen to your wagon. And you would have three sets of yoke of oxen, so 6 oxen to pull this wagon. An ox is a trained steer, a male cow that knows how to pull wagons. And this wagon is holding about 2,000 to 2,300 pounds of supplies. And this is what you need for your 6-month journey from Independence, Missouri, the beginning point of the California Trail, to Sutters Fort, the end point. So you're going to have all of just your supplies because you're walking the whole way alongside. If you're riding in this wagon, it means less stuff. And we're going to come around the back here, and I want you to think about what would you take in your wagon. And after this program today, I want you to mark off in your home 10 feet by 4 feet, because I want to see if you can fit all of your belongings in a wagon. Now, there is definitely no room for your bed or your family's prized piano. This is only for your necessary supplies for that 6-month journey. You're going to have at least 600 to 700 pounds of food, and it's dried food because there's no grocery stores along the way. There's nothing really between Missouri and Sutters Fort except for a couple other trading posts that there's several hundred miles in between. You're going to have barrels of flour. You're going to have bags of beans, bags of rice. Dad's going to be hunting for some fresh meat along the way for buffalo, deer, elk. You're going to have barrels of water. And you're going to be traveling along rivers and streams as much as possible for fresh water. Now, if Dad is a blacksmith, he's going to be bringing his anvil and his tools, and that anvil weighs about 200 pounds, and all of his tools weigh several hundred pounds. And you're going to be doing all of your cooking along the way by fire. You're going to dig a fire pit. At the end of the day, when you stop, unload your wagon, you're going to dig a hole, build a fire, and cook with cast iron. Now, this cast iron pot weighs 40 pounds. So if you have 3 of these, you're looking at 120 pounds alone. So you're not even going to have a lot of cookware. This is cast iron. So this isn't something that a blacksmith would make. This is being made in a factory back in a big city. So you're going to do all of your cooking in this of meat, beans, and rice, and some simple bread, meat, beans, and rice. And the next day, meat, beans, and rice. Do you get the point that you're eating the same thing about every day? Now, you're only going to be wearing the clothes on your backs and plus another pair of clothes. But luckily, you do bring your washing machine with you, this washboard. You can wash your clothes somewhat. You only wash your clothes about once or twice a month anyways. But the good thing about this washboard is that it served another purpose. In some way, now you couldn't bring your family's prized piano, and I should note that your whole family is sharing this wagon. Your parents, you, all of your siblings, and at this time, families had about 5 to 7 kids, and your extended family as well sharing this wagon. But you don't have your family's prized piano. In another wagon, they might have a guitar. Another wagon might have a violin, and you got the washboard. And around the campfire at night, you might sing some simple songs like, "Old Susanna, stay away from me. I'm trying to prevent COVID, so stay away 6 feet." I think that's how that song goes. Clearly, I've given up a very prosperous music career to be an interpreter with California State Parks. Let's talk about the outside of the wagon here. We've got this grease bucket to talk about it. This would be full of animal fat to grease the wagon axles, to make sure these wheels move properly. You want to make sure these wheels don't squeak too much. The wheels are made out of wood, and you got an iron tire to protect it. And you'll notice how high this wagon is off the ground. This back wheel is almost 5 feet tall. The wheel in the front's a little bit smaller, but you got this tall wagon. So it's high off the ground because this is your all-terrain vehicle. This is like a mixture of a pickup truck and an SUV, and you're traveling all types of terrain, rocks, mud, rivers and streams. You want to be able to have this cross all of that stuff. And a job that you would have to do, children would have to do along the trails. You see this piece of cloth right here? You had to count how many times that went around the wheel. That's your odometer. And 360 rotations on this, because we've tested it before, means you've traveled a mile. and you were traveling about 12 to 15 miles a day. Sounds like a pretty boring job, but it was something to do. There'd also be a piece of canvas across the bottom of the wagon, high up, so that you can be collecting stuff along the way, such as firewood to burn, so that for your fire at night. And you were also collecting, if you're crossing the plains and there's no trees, you don't have any firewood, but there's a lot of buffalo. And a job for children would be to collect buffalo chips, which is dried buffalo poop that you would toss into that piece of canvas, and children would have competitions as to how many buffalo chips they would collect. And that's what you would burn as a fuel so that you could cook with. And we're going to come back over here to talk about some of the games that children would play along the trail, which I can assure you there wasn't that many, and there certainly were no video games. And the toys that you had were based on the materials that you had. Turn this around. So you got a lot of cloth, old cloth, not nice cloth like my shirt, but old cloth, and you got bags of beans. So bean bags were very popular that you would play along the trail for a simple bean bag toss, or maybe even tossing it into a bucket or juggling. You also had old cloth that you could make a rag doll. Now, this would be about a more family that did not have a lot of wealth would have a simple rag doll made out of old cloth. Now, you might have read about the Donner Party. You might have read about Patty Reed, an 8-year-old girl that traveled with the Donner Party, and she brought with her a small doll that is typically on display in our orientation room here at Sutters Fort. That doll is made out of wood. The Reed and Donner families were a lot more wealthy than other families coming to California, because remember, a lot of these folks are looking for a better way of life. They would have a simple Pioneer rag doll. Now, you could learn how to make your own rag doll on our Sutters Fort YouTube page. Now, ask permission before going on to YouTube that you could learn how to make your own Pioneer rag doll. They also would make corn husk dolls. Back east, they got a lot of corn, which means you have a lot of corn husks. So you could make your own corn husk doll or corn husk action figure. And a game that was very popular was called the Game of Graces. It was played by 2 Pioneer children that would each hold 2 sticks, and there was a wooden hoop. And it was like the pioneers knew about social distancing in the 1840s, because you had to stand at least 10 feet away from each other in order to play this game. What you do is you have your sticks crossed like this, and moving really fast causes that hoop to fly through the air, and the other person would catch it. It's called the Game of Graces. Now, after your 6 months, you've arrived here at Sutters Fort. Sutter wants people to stay here in this area. He's encouraging them to stay here because remember, he needs skilled workers to build up his fort. And the most important job that he really needed on the frontier were blacksmiths. In the corner of the fort, we had a blacksmith shop. Some of Sutter's blacksmiths that we know of were Samuel Neal, James H. Jones, James Gregson. His wife, Eliza Gregson, wrote a memoir, taught other women how to read and write here during the Mexican-American War, and also a man that we only know of by the name of Hugenberger. Were blacksmiths here at the fort that would have a forge of a fire of 3,000 degrees that they were heating the metal. And while you're heating the metal to about 2,100 degrees, it means it's bright yellow. That forge at 3,000, that's 800 degrees hotter than lava. But you want the metal at about 2,100, it's bright yellow. It means the iron is very malleable. You'd bring it out holding tongs, and you want to strike while the iron is hot on the anvil to shape it into whatever tools or goods that you're making. The blacksmiths were like the hardware store of the 1840s. They are making metal goods for all the other workers out of iron and steel, not cast iron like that cast iron pot you saw. That would be made in a factory. And they're not using things like thin metal that's made by a tinsmith. And Sutter had a tinsmith that could make tin cups and tin buckets. But they're also making tools for the other workers, hammers for the carpenters, and they're making all the kitchenware inside the kitchen, forks, spoons, knives, spatulas, ladles. All of that is made out of metal from the blacksmith shop. There's nothing made out of plastic. And other stuff that they would make, Sutter's got a lot of horses. And that's your main mode of transportation around the fort and around Sutter's land grant. And each riding horse needs 4 horseshoes. So Sutter's blacksmiths are making horseshoes. They're also making nails for the carpenters. But Sutter's carpenters know all the tricks of the trades. And they know how to put together furniture and structures using the least amount of nails as possible, using dovetailing and mortise and tenon joint to save on nails because metal was very hard to come by. This was something that Sutter had to trade for on the coast, for iron bars. Everything that was metal here at the fort was made in the blacksmith shop. Besides the cast metal, even a hook to hang your hat is made inside the blacksmith shop. Sutter had a cooper shop right over here along the south wall, were Sutter's coopers, Claude Chena, a Frenchman. He had Daniel Leahy, and a man by the name of Jackson, who was of African descent, were Sutter's coopers, making barrels, buckets, and butter churns. Barrels, this is your shipping container this is your shipping container and your Amazon box of the 1840s. This is how Sutter is shipping goods out of the fort. A barrel of nails, a barrel of pickles, a barrel of flour, a barrel of hardtack, all of that being made in the cooper shop. And they're barrels of all sizes. This is a very small barrel that they would be making. They're also making wooden buckets, and they're making butter churns. Anything involving hoops and staves. Staves are wooden slats held together by hoops. And a butter churn that Sutter had dairy cows right outside the gate that they would milk, and with a heavy cream, they would churn for 30 to 45 minutes just so that they had butter to butter your bread with dinner. All of that from the cooper shop. And as I mentioned, Sutter had cooks. William Daler, who was a former sailor who jumped ship in Monterey to come work here at the fort. Also, a man of African descent by the name of Jim Myers worked in the kitchen, along with many other Native American workers, making meals for Sutter's 200 to 600 workers, depending on the harvest season. And they are making 2 meals a day inside the kitchen on the other side of the fort. And what they made depended on the harvest season, because Sutter had outside the fort, just north, produce gardens, but they were growing all types of fruits and vegetables. And they would try to preserve as much as possible through pickling or drying. But people who visited the fort at the off seasons wrote that they would have for 2 weeks straight beef, beans, and bread. That sounds very exciting for a meal each day. Sutter also had outside the fort 10,000 cows, where Sutter had cattle brands made by the blacksmiths, has his initials, JAS, for John Augustus Sutter. And this is how Sutter is able to keep track of his cows from everybody else's, because there's other land grants that start to form and ranches in the area that all have cattle. They all have their own cattle brands with their different initials and symbols, and try to make your own cattle brand at home using your initials and symbols, and register it with your teacher so that you can keep track of your homework versus everybody else's. And Sutter had about 10,000 head of cows that are managed by Sutter's vaqueros or cowboys, which were made up of men from the local native villages who also served in Sutter's militia if the fort was ever attacked. But remember, the fort was never attacked. They were slaughtering 5 to 6 cows a day to feed Sutter's workers, but the most important part of the cow was the hides and the tallow. The hides, or the skin, now this is just a small sample, but picture a large cow hide that they could tan into leather to make belts, bags, and shoes. And Sutter had a shoemaker making shoes just like the ones I'm wearing. And if anybody has any issues putting their left shoe on their right foot or vice versa, not a problem in the 1840s because your right and the left were the same shoe. You would actually interchange it often so that you would evenly wear down the sole of the shoe. And that's the only thing that you would have replaced. Sutter had a shoemaker that was making shoes just like those that I'm wearing and also repairing them. You would wear the same pair of shoes for several years. Now, along with the hides, tallow was valuable, which is rendered beef fat that they could have a big cauldron that they can dip a cotton wick over and over 30 to 50 times to make candles, just so that you could see here at night. There's no electricity in the 1840s. They got to see by candles. And it was unprofitable to work by candlelight. When the sun went down, everybody would go home. And that is why Sutter would have tents and shacks everywhere outside. People would go home. Only Sutter and a couple of clerks actually lived within the walls of the fort. And it would take about 15 to 20 of these candles to light one of these rooms anyways. Also, soap could be made from tallow, which, could you imagine beef fat soap to wash with? That doesn't sound very clean, but that's what our blacksmith uses. And now you're only taking a bath every once or twice every 2 weeks anyway, so it's not even a big deal. Sutter had also thousands of acres of wheat outside the fort that would be harvested. The wheat would be harvested, and you would cut off the tops, and they'd lay it out on big threshing floors, these big wooden floors outside the fort, yay high with this wheat, and they would have horses trample across it to break it all up. In the bastions in the corner, they would throw it out the windows on a windy day, and that wind would blow away the chaff from the wheat berry falling down to the ground. And they would collect the wheat, this wheat like this, and at Sutter's grist mill in the corner, they would grind it into flour, where Sutter was selling barrels of flour to trade, but also flour for Sutter's bakery. Right behind me is the bake oven outside the bakery here. And this is how they bake bread at the fort. This has no knobs or anything like that. You've got to have a fire for at least 4 hours to preheat this oven, a decent sized fire to get this going. You would remove the fire, bake the bread right in on the bricks, and as the oven cooled over time, you would put smaller and smaller breads until it's about 250 degrees. You're making hardtack, which consists of flour, water, and salt. And it bakes into a very hard biscuit that you can't just take a bite out of it unless you want to chip a tooth. You would break this up into a stew or soup like you would put crackers in and soften it up. And that's how you could consume it. And this is how you could consume bread where you have no oven. And this was a major commodity for sailors on ships where they don't have an oven. And this can be preserved for forever as long as it doesn't come in contact with any moisture. This can last for weeks, if not months, maybe years, if it's preserved properly. So the bakery needs a fire. The kitchen needs a fire. The blacksmith needs a fire. Fire was important on the frontier, not only for the jobs here, but also for survival and for warmth. I'm going to show you how they would make fire in the 1840s. And I'm gonna make it using flint and steel. There is no lighter or matches in the 1840s. So you need three things to make a fire, make a triangle. You need fuel, air, and heat to make a fire. If you don't have all three, you don't have a fire, which is why if you ever find yourself on fire, hopefully no, what are you supposed to do? Stop, drop, and roll. Rolling around on the ground, you're trying to take away the oxygen from the fire. If you throw a bucket of water on the fire and it goes out, you're taking away the heat. If you stop adding anything to your fire and it goes out, you're taking away the fuel. Three things to make a fire. Here is my heat. When I strike against the flint, my steel striker, you see sparks. That's shavings of the metal coming off. That's my heat. But those go away very quickly. I need something to catch one of those sparks. And in my tin container here, I have char cloth, which is a charred fabric made from an old shirt that's been charred down, kind of like the process of turning firewood into charcoal. You're turning cloth into char cloth. It's going to catch one of those sparks. And then I'm going to take some rope that I have fluffed up, and that's going to be my good tinder to get my fire going here. So first I'm going to catch one of these sparks. Easier said than done. Let me get some charred string instead. You got to have a good edge. Get a different rock. And as you can see, it wasn't just a simple task. And it was even more difficult if your char cloth was either damp or your tinder. Let's try this again. There we go. It's all about having the right material. So you see that glowing there? That is my charcoal. I got it. I got an ember there. I'm going to take this. So I got my heat and I got my fuel. Now I'm getting some wind here. I'm getting some smoke. So now I got my heat. I got my fuel. Last thing I need is air. So I'm going to blow on this. And that's how you would make fire in the 1840s here on the frontier. Hopefully it'd take a little bit faster than I did. And as that gets going, I'd start adding bigger pieces and then push it to the back, get a large fire going to bake bread. So by 1846, Sutter's got a very prosperous fort. It's got lots of wagon parties settling in this area. And it's important to know that, remember, Sutter is a loyal Mexican citizen. That's why he flies the Mexican civil flag here at the fort, the Mexican flag without the symbol. The eagle would only be put on official flags at capitals and presidios. Middle of nowhere Sutters Fort, only flying the civil flag. But there's so many wagon parties settling in this area that many of them do not become Mexican citizens like Sutter And the Mexican government becomes very fearful. And in April of 1846, General Jose Castro, the general of the Mexican cavalry and acting military governor in Monterrey, issues a proclamation ordering the mass deportation of undocumented Americans from Mexican California by the end of the year if they did not produce citizenship papers. Well, this created a fear for all the Americans that were living here at Sutters Fort in the surrounding area, that many of them decided to take action. In June of 1846, 30 men and their families, they banded together. They called themselves the Los Osos, or the Bears, and they decided that they were going to take over the Mexican Army's headquarters on the northern frontier in Sonoma. And on June 14th, 1846, those 30 men and their families, they took over the Sonoma Barracks, where Sonoma State Historic Park is today. They arrested General Mariano Vallejo, and they proclaimed California an independent nation. This became known to history as the Bear Flag Revolt. And while they're in Sonoma, William Todd, the nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln, designed the Bear Flag, which had a red star. He wrote California Republic, that this was to be the name of their new nation. He also put on the flag a ferocious grizzly bear. I think William Todd was a terrible artist. But William Ide proclaimed himself president of the new republic because William Ide Adobe State Historic Park, where Red Bluff is today, named after him. He proclaimed himself president because he was the only one that could read, write, and drafted the California Declaration of Independence. Stay in school, kids. But the Bear Flag Republic only lasted 3 weeks, because on July 7th, 1846, Commodore Sloat and the United States Navy arrived in Monterey and raised the 28-star United States flag over the Presidio and Customs House. And this began the American occupation and the Mexican-American War here in California. And 4 days later, on July 11th, 1846, Joseph Warren Revere, the grandson of Paul Revere, arrived here at the fort and brought the 28-star flag to fly over Sutters Fort. And he drew this drawing, which became known as the most accurate drawing of Sutters Fort in the 1840s. And with Revere bringing the flag, Sutter loses his fort. John Charles Fremont takes the fort from Sutter's control, and this becomes an outpost for the United States military during the Mexican-American War. Now, there's no battles here in Northern California. They were all in Southern California, but this was used as an outpost. Sutter loses control of his fort, and he doesn't get the fort back until the summer of 1847. And he realizes that this is going to become an American territory. There's even going to be more Americans settling in this area. He needs to finish building his town. He had it surveyed, the town of Sutterville, which was going to be south of Sutter's Fort. That's where he was going to build his town, out of the floodplain. But he needs to build that town, though. There's going to be more people settling here. But we're going to continue this story upstairs in the central building. We're going to go on up here, and I want you to think, when we go up these stairs and cross through that door up there, just think, John Sutter, John Bidwell, who's later the founder of the city of Chico, where Bidwell Mansion State Historic Park is, Charles Weber, the founder of the city of Stockton, Mariano Vallejo, Jose Castro, Kit Carson, John Charles Fremont, Nancy Kelsey, Eliza Gregson, all these notable figures of California history with cities and towns named after them cross through these doors just like we are right now. And we got these 3 feet thick adobe walls. And I want to take this time right now to thank the doctors, the nurses, and the medical professionals that are keeping us safe right now during this COVID-19 pandemic, making sure we are all safe. And let's all be thankful they're not using this equipment. This is our doctor's office. Sutter had a couple resident doctors over the years to treat all types of illnesses and injuries and epidemics that happened here, such as a measles epidemic that broke out in 1847. I could tell you, though, that Sutter's doctors lacked a lot of medical skills, and many of them on the frontier did not have a lot of education when it came to medicine. They read a couple books, studied for about 6 months or a year, and that was it. And doctors, even doctors, didn't know about modern medicine, and they didn't know about germ theory. They did not know that washing your hands and covering your mouth when you cough or covering your nose when you sneeze could help prevent illnesses and viruses from spreading. So I hope you're washing your hands during this time. But here in the doctor's office, we have amputation tools, which a common cut from an axe or a knife might lead to infection that might lead to amputation because they did not have medicines like we have today. These are cauterizing tools. This is a tourniquet, scalpels. And when you're being operated on, there was no anesthesia. There was nothing to knock you out. So they might literally have you bite down on just a piece of leather, or you might literally have to bite the bullet. And these are tools for finding that bullet that might be lodged in you. And this is for removing that bullet. And say you've fallen off of a horse, hit your head on a rock, and you got all this swelling in your head. They thought that the trepan was helpful. This was to relieve that pressure in your head. They would drill a hole in your head. And would you believe about 40% of people survived this? Now you got this hole in your head. They'd put a hammered down coin in there. Now you have a steel plate. And doctors also did dentistry. Now, dentistry was not really a separate practice because dentistry only really consisted of pulling teeth. Because nobody really brushed their teeth in the 1840s. A family might share a toothbrush. Or if they didn't even have a toothbrush, they'd put up crushed up seashells on it on a piece of cloth and rub it against your teeth and use that as a toothbrush. But this is a tooth key. This would hook around your tooth and twist. And that's how they would remove it. And look at how thick a piece of metal that is. Think you could get that around your tooth? Well, not a problem in life long ago in the 1840s because you typically were missing the tooth next to it. So you could easily wrap around there. And they thought leeches were good. They thought that if you were sick, it meant you had bad blood. So the leeches would suck out that bad blood and your heart would produce good blood. But they did know, doctors knew about sterilizing their equipment. They knew about boiling water. And this is a brazier. This is your 19th century hot plate. If you don't know what a hot plate is, just wait till you're a freshman in college, and that's all you have to cook with. This is how you could have a small fire in your room for heat, and also you can heat up a pot of water to sterilize your tools. And they did have 2 hospital beds in here, frame made by Sutter's carpenters, and underneath you would have rope. That you'd want to make sure that rope is tight because if it was loose, the bed would sag. You know the phrase sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite? It comes from these rope frame beds. Because if the rope was loose, it's going to sag down to the ground where all the bugs are. And there's your chamber pot. That's your bathroom, not your everyday bathroom. But if you need to go to the bathroom at night, you're not going to go out where there's coyotes and bears. You're going to use the chamber pot. And unfortunately, the job for children in the morning was to empty the chamber pots. We're going to continue our story over in the clerk's office, where, remember, Sutter has just gotten the fort back after the Mexican-American War, and he is going to contract in this office. John Bidwell is going to write the contract between John Sutter and James Marshall for building a sawmill. They found the location in the Coloma Valley, where Coloma is today. That's where they were going to build a sawmill off the South Fork of the American River. It is also in this office where John Bidwell kept the ledger books. He kept track of everybody who worked here at the fort. And if you worked here at the fort, you were paid at the fort. Everybody that was here was paid in some good, some better than others. It depends on your skills and the job that you had. Your common worker is getting paid about 50 cents a day. So could you imagine this knife here cost about $1.50? Can you imagine working 3 days of labor for that knife? 2 to 3 days of labor for a blanket made in the blanket factory, where Sutter's got thousands of sheep that they're shearing the sheep, spinning the wool into yarn, where they're weaving blankets. They got 5 to 6 days for a hatchet, 15 to 20 days for a cast iron pot, 20 to 40 days for a saddle made by one of Sutter's vaqueros. So everything just took a lot of time working. And your work week was about 6 days of work at 10 hours a day at least. But at this spot is where John Bidwell wrote the contract between Sutter and James Marshall for building the sawmill. And while Marshall was building the sawmill, it's nearly completed in January of 1848. And he's checking the tail race on January 24th, 1848. He's checking where the water is flowing off the American River through a channel called a tail race that powers a water wheel to go around, to power a saw to go up and down for cutting the trees into lumber. And he finds 3 pieces of gold in the tail race. And 4 days later, Sutter writes in the New Helvetia Diary, Marshall arrived from the mountains with important business. That important business was the gold discovery. And here in Sutter's office, they tested whether or not that gold was real. And they find out that it is. And they try to keep it secret for about 2 weeks until word gets out and the gold rush begins. And all of Sutter's workers leave the fort. They no longer want to work for Sutter, getting about 50 cents a day, where they think gold is out there in the rivers the size of your fist. So Sutter is faced with a dilemma. He doesn't have anybody working at the fort anymore. It becomes a ghost town, kind of like how it is right now. He's got nobody to work in the rooms of his shops. And you see that cannon right there? We fire that cannon often during our events. That cannon came from Fort Ross. It's part of Sutter's Fort Ross purchase. And Sutter, when he bought Fort Ross for $30,000 in 1841 on credit, he still owed the Russians $20,000 by the time of the gold discovery. And he owed other people thousands of dollars too, because Sutter was borrowing to build up his fort here. And he's faced with a dilemma. All these people are coming to collect. They don't realize, they think gold's discovered on his land. They don't realize where Sutter's mill is, where Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park is today, is 45 miles from here. So Sutter has no money, but he's got a lot of land. So he starts to sell land to pay off that debt. And the first pieces of land sold is Sutter's Fort. He sells the fort to about 12 different businesses that turn this place from an agricultural and manufacturing center to purely California's first mall, selling goods to the gold miners. It had saloons, gambling parlors. There were 2 bowling alleys and mercantile stores that looked just like this, selling goods to the incoming gold miners. No longer was this stuff being made here at the fort. is just being sold at high prices because this stuff was being brought in by ship from the United States, by ships that had to travel all the way around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, to California to unload these goods 2 miles from us at the waterfront, brought here to be sold, blankets and shirts, pants, shoes, buckets, but the main thing, mining tools, shovels, pickaxes, tin pans, everything a gold miner needs for panning in the rivers and streams. But quickly though, these merchants, they realize they are far from where the action is, where the people are getting off the boats, these incoming gold miners, and where their stuff that they are selling is all along the Sacramento River, 2 miles from us, where old Sacramento is today. So they realize that they want to move their stores there, where they had just finished surveying this new city, the city of Sacramento. And all of a sudden, Sacramento starts to grow and Sutterville fails. And all these merchants, they move there. And when I mean these merchants move their stores there, I don't just mean they move their stuff. They take the bricks, they take the lumber, they take the shingles to build some of the first buildings in Sacramento City where old Sacramento is today. And quickly, large sections of the fort are destroyed for building materials. And by 1860, the only building that remained was the central building. And it remained the only structure till the late 1880s, when the city was actually going to destroy what was left of Sutters Fort to build houses here. Finally, Sacramento had expanded out this far from the river. But in 1890, the Native Sons of the Golden West, an early preservation group, purchased the central building and the 2 blocks of land to reconstruct the fort to what you see today. In 1895, the reconstruction was finished, and in 1895, Sutters Fort became a museum, and we've been a museum ever since, where we tell the tale of John Sutter, why he built the fort here, and not only Sutter, but all the other individuals that played a key role in California history and the development of the Sacramento Valley. And the reason that I have all this information to share with you today is because people wrote stuff down in the 19th century. Sutter kept a diary and a journal. So did James Marshall. So did John Bidwell. Eliza Gregson wrote a memoir. Patty Reed wrote a memoir about her experiences with the Donner Party. All these people wrote about their experiences. And it was incredibly important for us to understand what was life like in the 1840s to be able to share it with you. And so I ask you, and I could tell you that they probably never thought that their diary or journal was going to end up in a museum. So I ask you, during this time where we are making history every day, write about what you do each day and your perspective on everything. Because during this time, we are in an unprecedented pandemic, unlike that hasn't been seen in over 100 years. Write about what you do each day, because you never know when your diary or journal might end up in a museum or archive, and somebody might be writing something or wanting to learn about what was life like in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic from a child's perspective. You could be the one helping write history for future generations. And I'll help you out for today, that you learned about Sutters Fort from a guy named Jared Jones who was wearing funny pioneer clothes and I didn't understand any of his jokes. But start to write stuff down, because it'll be incredibly important for future generations. I want to thank you all for tuning in to my program today, learning about life long ago at Sutters Fort. We hope to see you soon when we reopen, but for now, stay home, stay healthy, stay safe. We hope to see you soon here in the future. This is Jared Jones from Sutters Fort State Historic Park telling you, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.